Okay, everybody, this is Jay Papasan. Welcome to the One Thing webinar for April with Tim Grahl. We're going to be discussing the one thing to build your permission platform. I'm super excited about this topic for a couple of reasons. As we've been working on our next book, our next business book, we've been really exploring this topic, and my co-author, Gary Keller, has really started preaching it. He's been preaching it to our business owners. He's been reading books and sharing them in the building, and has been preaching it to the top business owners that we work with, that this is where we're going, and for a lot of reasons, that a permission platform allows you to control your funnel for your business. It gives you ownership of your lead generation, and it doesn't ever hand it off to someone else. It does take some work, but Tim has done this. He's done it in my field for authors, and he's also done it for other business owners. He's an entrepreneur, I think 3 times over, and his most recent venture, using the techniques he's going to talk about today, he's generated $500,000 income just 3 years and change into that business. And I can tell you, in the publishing world, that's a great success story. It's a great success story in any field. I first encountered Tim because he's the author of a book called Your First 1,000 Copies, a step-by-step guide to marketing your book. This is a fantastic work. And I actually think, like, a lot of people took our first book, The Millionaire Real Estate Agent, and said, hey, that's kind of a business book. It just happens to be marketed to real estate agents. I think that's a marketing platform book that happened to be marketed to authors. And I read through that and immediately started exploring, what does this mean for my real estate business? What does this mean for our investing business? What does this mean for our private equity company? Because he's asking bigger questions than just publishing questions. So I obviously highly recommend it. I read it, and I bought copies for everyone in our marketing department and asked them to read it before we met. Tim has also worked with top authors like Hugh Howey. I just finished his book, Wool, by the way, which rocks. Daniel Pink is a great business author, one of my favorites. And frankly, Dan and Chip Heath, who've written 3 outstanding books and maybe more that are sitting on a special shelf of mine where I keep my favorite business books, Barbara Corcoran and many, many others, and help them become New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestsellers. And this is all through a lot of the techniques we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to go back one more thing before I dive in and we get to our conversation with Tim. I'm just trying to set it up. Tim, if you can't tell, I'm a bit of a fanboy. I think this guy tells the truth, and I think he tells it in a way that we can take action, which is my favorite kind of author. But the importance of this topic, I just don't want you to underestimate it. We're looking in the real estate industry, right? Gary and I have incubated a publishing company out of a real estate franchise company. And we're looking at all the ways people generate leads for these businesses. They cold call, they warm call, they knock on doors, they send out mailers. And if you look at what's happening in industry right now, there is a lot of ratcheting down on the kind of aggressive tactics that most people use without permission. What really got our attention, if you just Google it, Dish Network and Do Not Call list, they have fined the Dish Network $24 billion for violating the Do Not Call list. And if you look at their public valuation, that's about 3 times what they're worth if you sold all of their stock. So they're sending a signal that aggressive tactics without the permission of people, they're going to have a really low tolerance for this in the future. And if you look just north of the border, which we have a lot of our associates, they passed an anti-spam act that had serious teeth in it. And you had to go back to existing clients, people who'd actually done business with you, sold houses, regular clients, and get new permission to send them emails. So you're seeing across the board that if you're reaching out and talking to people in this society where we're all feeling a little over-connected, there's going to be a little bit more than slapping people's hands. So to me, getting a handle on how we get a permission relationship with our customers is one of the most important conversations we can have. So if I haven't sold it hard enough, right? If you can't tell that I'm earnestly behind this, I am, folks. This is a big topic for me. No pressure, Tim. Tim's sitting there in his hotel room getting ready for this going, oh, great, no pressure. But it is a big topic, and it is an important one for all of us. I'm going to quickly, in our research and our surveys, and I hope you'll fill out the one at the end of this webinar, about 30% of the people who show up for these calls are unfamiliar with the one thing. You just wanted to hear about this topic. I'm going to do about 3 slides, give you the big idea, because It's the One Thing webinar, and I'm going to be using that language, and I want you to know what we're talking about. So I'm going to ask for 5 minutes. I'm going to do a quick run through, and then we're going to bring Tim on, and he and I are going to go through the high points of how you build a permission platform, and then open it up to direct Q&A with you. So final reminder, I did it twice before we started. There is a questions toolbar associated with GoToWebinar. You can type your questions in there and we will answer them at the end. So if you are excited to hear about building a permission platform, just give me a yes there. That'll be your practice. Just give us a yes and let us know that this is a topic. Boom, there are the yeses. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Lisa. You're blowing up my screen. All right, good. You're as excited as I am. I'm going to dive in real quick. Let's knock out the one thing. Let's get to Tim. So first and foremost, this one thing, this is a book, it's The Surprisingly Simple Truth Behind Extraordinary Results. What are we getting at here? The simple fundamental truth here is we're leveraging Pareto's principle. You know, Pareto's principle is an Italian economist. He was back in the 19th century, observed that 80% of the wealth in Italy was held by 20% of the people. That didn't really get a lot of fanfare when he originally observed it. But in the 1920s, a guy named Joseph Duran, a quality control expert, was made aware of this at his work. It was a compensation study for executives. And they ran across this, and he had the aha, you know, he's a quality control guy. 80% of the defects, roughly, would come from 20% of the flaws in the process. And he saw this as a massive leverage principle that extended well beyond economics. And he actually wrote it up in his kind of the Bible for quality control. And that is how that idea, the Pareto's principle or the 80-20, really got popularized. We believe that this is a fundamental law of success. And the people who really get the highest success focus on the vital few, not the trivial many. And what we want you to do with the one thing is not just take the 20%. We want you to take the 20% of the 20% of the 20%, because if you keep saying, what's the 20% of this to-do list, eventually you'll get to what number? 1. There's always a prime number. There's always that number one thing that should be the first thing you tackle and the most important thing every day. And it's our goal in these conversations to try to really identify that. In my experience, most success usually boils down to a handful of things. And the number one, when you really become clear, is always there and it stands out. So hopefully we'll do that for you today. What we promise, right? If you're willing to run counter this world of distraction and all the things that we could be doing, and there's really only a few that we should, it's the idea of a geometric domino progression. I assume everybody on this webinar has lined up dominoes, right? It's the central metaphor in our book. If you line them up properly, you can knock over the first one, and what happens? Well, they all fall down, right? That's the idea of the one thing, that by doing one thing, you get many results. One of the cool things that we discovered is there's a guy who wrote in the American Journal of Physics, Lorne Whitehead. He discovered that a 2-inch domino can knock over a 3-inch domino, and a 3-inch domino can knock over a 4.5-inch domino. You get where I'm going with this. Each domino is 50% larger, but there's enough momentum there to make it happen. So you can create not just a lot of things happening, but it can get bigger and bigger and bigger. And he built them out of wood. And by the 9th domino, it was taller than a door frame. So what began with a 2-inch domino was actually having this huge result. And he described that what began with a gentle tick ended with a large slam. And so we played with this idea. We said, if you could take that out, to its logical conclusion, if you started with a 2-inch domino, the laws of physics say that by the 18th, and they were growing at that rate, it would knock over a domino taller than the Tower of Pisa. By the 23rd, it would knock over a domino as tall as the Eiffel Tower. And a lot of people just don't get the significance of that statement. The Eiffel Tower is over 1,000 feet tall, folks. It's as tall as the Empire State Building. It's a huge monument. It's the biggest. It would be the tallest building in Seattle. It would be the tallest building in San Francisco, Boston, so many towns. It would be the thing that really marked the skyline. By the 31st, that 2-inch domino would have grown so powerful, the momentum built up, it would knock over a domino 3,000 feet above Mount Everest. And by the 57th, like if you suspend all the physics in terms of gravity, it could knock over a domino that would reach almost all the way to the moon. The point here is the shape. In big success, extraordinary success, our research and our experience leads us to believe that when you focus on the most important things, what can begin so small that it really doesn't seem significant can, in relatively rapid terms, become so big you can barely get your mind around it. There's momentum, it's a virtuous cycle. And that's what we want in our lives. We want to focus on less things for more effect. And as Gary puts it, fewer side effects, right? Because we all know how it feels to have too much on our plates. Ultimately, when we identify that one thing, we believe you should make it a habit, right? If it's a fundamental part of your success, you want to be doing it every day. And one of the coolest things we found in writing the book is it doesn't take 21 days to form a habit. The actual science leads us to believe on average it takes 66 days. So if you can identify the one thing for your success in an area, and today we're hopefully going to be identifying that through these conversations. Where's the starting point, the real crux for building a permission platform, or at least a handful of true priorities, right? You want to give those things focus. And if you build a habit, you have to work to build that habit, but around day 66, that work starts paying off and there's less and less effort involved for you to do the thing that gives you the biggest success possible. So this is all around this idea of, what's the one thing in a given area? And today we're attacking business, right? In different ones, we've covered physical health, personal life, key relationships, even finances. But today we're going to go back to business and we're going to tackle this with Tim. And just a reminder, even though I actually think he started his career as a programmer. And Tim, if you're there, go ahead and prepare yourself to unmute here. I'm going to introduce you. Get a sense of his history, but he has mastered something that I think we can all apply for our personal brand, for our personal business, and for our bigger business if that's where we are in our life. So Tim, if you're there, welcome to the One Thing webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I was getting all excited about who you're having on the show, and I kept having to remind myself it was me because you really talked it up.
Well, I warned you, man. I've read your books. I give them away in droves. I've been in this business for 20 years. And so I know you were writing to my industry, but I've not seen anybody nail it with that much authority. So I know that we can talk about this in a broader terms because we have people from all industries here. But again, thank you. I know that you'll deliver. I've heard you before, and this should be awesome. So really quickly, Tim, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came to kind of understand why a permission platform is important? And I put it on the screen, kind of the three things that we might address, if there were the three dominoes: permission, content, and outreach. How did you get to this awareness of a permission platform being so necessary?
Well, like you mentioned, I had gone to school to be a programmer, and a few years after college, had quit my job to just freelance programming, and there's all kinds of backstory to that, and learning, and I was really getting into online marketing and figuring out how to get people to actually pay attention to what you're doing online. And through a bunch of stuff, ended up working for this guy named Ramit Sethi on the launch of his book, I Will Teach You to Be Rich. So this was, I think, 2007. And I worked with him the whole year leading up to the launch of the book. And honestly, I didn't think it would do much. I didn't know much about book marketing. I didn't know much about, how, I just kind of assumed, big authors that hit the New York Times list had big time publicists and big time money and all this kind of stuff, and didn't really understand how it all worked. So I was just kind of doing the nuts and bolts stuff for Ramit. And then when his book came out, he didn't have a publicist. He wasn't spending any money on like marketing or advertising in the traditional sense, and he wasn't doing any of the kind of traditional stuff. But yet his book debuted the first week on the New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller list, and all of those sales came through the people he was directly connected to through his fan base. And that's when I really started scratching my head and wondering, like, how did he pull this off? Because I had no idea that you could do this without being some big shot. He's younger than I am, and, had this platform, this website, this blog that he built and had followers and fans, and he launched this book and it jumped on the bestseller list. And so that kind of put me on the road to figuring out how this stuff works. I pretty naturally constantly want to break things down and figure out how they work and how I can replicate them And so I started working with more and more authors and basically used all of them to test out all of my ideas on how to do this stuff. And as I got better and better at it, learned more and more, it kind of culminated into the first big launch I did was for Dan Pink and for his book To Sell is Human. And that was after running his platform for 3 years and really putting these ideas into practice. He kind of turned the whole thing over to me and trusted me to, build it to a point where what he wanted was to be able to reliably launch a bestseller without having to spend a bunch of money or worry about a publicist, get him on all the right shows and all that kind of stuff. And sure enough, his book came out, and through his own platform, we debuted the book at #1 on the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post bestseller lists. And then just 3 months later, we did it again for Chip and Dan Heath and put them at #2 on the New York Times list. And that same week, I actually had 5 clients on the bestseller list at the same time.
Wow.
And that's when I was like, oh, I've hit on something, you know. And so I started looking at what pieces actually made this work, and that's where I came up with permission, content, and outreach. Those are the 3 steps that I identified that every author, every entrepreneur, everybody trying to build connections with their audience, they have to solve each of those 3 pieces. And if they're able to do that, they're going to find success.
So why don't you? I love that story. And was it you or was it Dan that came up with this idea of the completely irregular newsletter? Because the moment I saw the title for his newsletter, and I'm sorry, I'm totally botching it. I thought, oh my gosh, he's completely created this in such a way that he doesn't even have a job with his content outreach. Was that his idea or your
Yeah,
idea? Just out of
no,
curiosity.
that's all Dan.
Okay.
Yeah, it's he's a really savvy guy. So most of what comes out of like I kind of am like, hey, we kind of need to solve this particular problem, and he comes up with some brilliant idea that works amazing. So yeah, no, that was his thing.
All right. So without getting too inside baseball, because like that's one of the people I follow, permission, content, outreach. Why permission first?
Well, permission is, so I define marketing because when people think about marketing, they have all kinds of reactions to it. And so my definition of marketing is first, you create long-lasting connections with people, and then second, you focus on being relentlessly helpful. And what I found is if you do those 2 things, you're going to find success. That's marketing. And so permission is all about building those long-term connections and having that permission to reach out to people. And I define permission as anything that gets people's attention and drives action. A lot of people, they'll talk about all kinds of stuff like email marketing or social media or blogging or, podcasting or 100 different things. And I try to remind people those are just tools in a toolbox, right? They all do different things, and they do certain things well and certain things not well. If I need to get a hammer or a nail into a board and I pull out a screwdriver, I'm just going to be frustrated. And so what I try to focus on is the overarching plan first, and then once we have a plan, then we can reach in our toolbox and start talking about the individual tools and whether or not they're a good fit. And so we have to know what we're trying to do. So permission is all about, do I have a connection with people that when I need to, I can get their attention and then I can drive action. I can actually get them to do something. And so that's what we want is business people is like if we have something to sell, if we have something to share, if we have something that we want to get out into the world, whether it's, get people to read this blog post or get people to buy this thing or get people to call us and hire us, we want to have a group of people that we can just reach out to and say and get their attention, and then when we ask them to do something, they actually do it. And
Right.
so that's how I define permission, because there's all these things that float around that people say are permission, but if you run it through that filter, you see that it's actually not. Because if it doesn't get people's attention and it doesn't drive action, it's not permission.
I'll say this, Tim, not to interrupt your flow, but I see all the focus on getting people's attention. People talk about it being viral and word of mouth, but fundamentally, as a business person, I don't care how much engagement a post got on Facebook if it didn't sell the product. Like that's the point of the exercise, right? is that what's the action? In this case, I was defining a sale. If it doesn't drive action, it hasn't really done its full job. And so I see a lot of people
Well,
missing the second half of your definition.
well, and that's why I focus on the long-term connection too, because something will go viral. If something goes viral and it gets a bunch of people's attention, and say they even go and buy something, if you can't replicate that, it's not helpful.
Right.
And so if you happen to do like put a cool video up on YouTube and it goes viral and it does something great for you, that's awesome. But if you can't replicate that, if you can't in any way capture those people into something where you can stay in connection with them long term, then it's not really helpful. It'll give you a nice little shot in the arm, but it's not going to do anything for you long term.
When you just said that,
So,
you made me think about, I don't know if you're familiar with the band OK Go.
yeah,
Like I remember seeing their first viral, video they shot for, one of their songs and thinking, wow, that's really cool. But they've replicated that. And I kept thinking, how can they continue to raise the bar? And the last one,
yeah,
they actually shot like the entire video through 70, like 27 flights in zero gravity. And it's absolutely astounding. But to do something repeatedly is a lot harder than just doing it once. So I just like, that's where my brain went with that, because it is, a lot of people stumble into success, but if they can't repeat it, it doesn't really serve them.
exactly, exactly. And I am all about finding patterns that normal people can do, right? So like my favorite example is Gary Vaynerchuk, right? Like you watch him, and like I see all these articles about how to market like Gary Vaynerchuk. Well, you know what? I'm not him. I do not have that personality. Like I'm an introvert. I'm not going to yell at anybody. I'm not going to go on Conan and lick a sock. Like that's not who I am. And so telling me to replicate somebody like Gary Vaynerchuk makes no sense, because without his personality, you can't nothing he does will work, because it's all kind of based on him, which is great. But it's great for Gary, but not great for me, who's an introvert and likes to like sit at home and not do that kind of stuff. And so I like to find patterns that are repeatable, that I can like hand out to people that aren't natural marketers, aren't natural extroverts, and they can find success with. Because that's who I am, and that's I work with authors, which fundamentally do their job so they can be left alone.
Yeah.
So so I try to find these things that are actually useful and repeatable for like normal human beings.
So what would be the
Um,
first step? Like in terms of if I'm taking notes at home, I need to get people's attention and drive action. Where would I start there? I intellectually get that. What would be the first step to kind of exploring that for somebody?
So the number one, so now we're going to switch to tools, and I always try to keep strategy and tools separate. The number one tool still for permission is building an email list. And I try to be very clear about that, because for years, even I thought like, well, Twitter and Facebook and all this stuff is going to replace it, but it just doesn't. We don't need to go into why, but I've just tested it like over and over and over and over and over, and it's not permission. It doesn't get people's attention. It doesn't drive action. Email is still the thing that works the best. And so I encourage people, start an email list and start getting people to subscribe to the email list. If that's the one thing you do, we're talking about one thing. And I actually talk about that. I think I say that, like, if this is the one thing you do, right? That write it on a post-it note, tattoo it on your forehead, whatever. Like, start building an email list now, because the more that you build that email list, the more you're going to have that group of people that you can get their attention and drive action. So go sign up. The platform I'm using now is ConvertKit.com. They're a fantastic platform. If you want to get started with something that's free, start with MailChimp. They have a free service. But start building an email list and start getting people on that email list. I actually think I focus more on building an email list than I do selling books, because if somebody buys a book, that's great. But if somebody signs up for my email list, I'll sell them this book and every other book I come out with in the future. And
Yeah.
so I'm always looking for that long-term connection, and that's what email lists. So the number one tool for permission right now is email, 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 email. Yeah, if you talk to anybody that's making money online, and you put in one bucket, like Facebook, Twitter, their blog, their podcast, their webinar series, whatever, and you put that in one bucket, and then the other bucket you just put their email list, and they had to choose one and give up the other bucket. All of them would choose their email list over all the other stuff because email list is where they make their money.
Right. I'll tell you, we kind of, I'd read your book, I'd shared it with our marketing team, and this is when we were launching the one thing, and we put monumental effort into those first 4 or 5 months. And I remember Ellen, at that time, who was leading our marketing, she got it really deeply. She goes, all this work that we're putting into this launch, if we are building an email list at the same time, then we're effectively launching every book that we have in the future. And so
Yeah.
if you built your list to 5,000, well, a year later, when you have the next thing, you have that 5,000 plus whatever you add to it. Then it just keeps magnifying over time what your efforts are. So I am in complete agreement. We went down this path because of you, and the last 3.5 years for us, I sat down with Gary at our monthly meeting for our company, and he agreed the number one metric for our success would be the size of our email list. Period.
Awesome. Oh man, that just warms my heart to hear you say that.
Well, I mean, you're talking, he's new to this game too. Like he's always played this, but he didn't play it with this language, and he just got it. It's crystal clear. And I mean, this is the most successful, in my opinion, real estate entrepreneur. He's got the number one real estate company in the world, and he
Mm.
gets this, and he's speaking this language now. And that's one of the reasons I was so excited to get you here and so amped up about this, because this is important stuff, and this is a fundamental piece that if you just did one thing for your business, getting that list in place is huge.
Yeah, I mean, because I look, because right now I have like 33,000 people. I think I'm past 33,000 now on my email list. And and what that does for me is like if everything else that I'm trying to do to make money completely just falls apart, I could fill up my coaching docket, I could fill up my consulting docket, I could like sell some products. Like I could in one email, I could turn things around. And so that's what, it becomes this just giant safety net where if I need like if everything else in my life falls apart and I need to pull something off, I have this huge group of people that I can email and get their attention and drive action to whatever I need.
Cool. So what would be the next step? We've got permission. We have the tool in place. It's and I've used Mailchimp. I haven't used ConvertKit, and I'm looking to Ian, our marketing team. I'm taking notes here. We'll write down the names of all these companies that we mentioned, and we'll post it to, where can we post this, Ian? We'll do it in the follow-up email. We'll make sure that everybody gets those in case you're missing it. I'm getting a lot of questions about the names of these companies, so we will hit everybody up on our email list with this. So where do we go from here? Permission, email list. What's next?
So then we look at content, and I look at content as basically I want to spread content freely and widely. And I look at content as ways to let people get to know me. So
Okay.
this is where things like blog posts, things like social media, things like podcasts and webinar series, basically, putting white papers out, any way that you put content out on the internet, it gives people a chance to get to know you. And I'm going to come back to that. So let me jump to outreach. And
Sure.
outreach, how I define outreach is it's basically all it is moving people from not knowing you exist to knowing you exist. That's it. Anytime that you're doing something where you're moving a group of people, whether it's 5 people or 5,000 people, from not knowing you exist to knowing you exist, that's outreach. And what's great is outreach and content often go hand in hand. So like right now, I'm doing outreach. Most of you on this webinar have never heard of me before, so I moved you from not knowing I exist to knowing I exist. And then I'm just sharing content for 45 minutes. Um, and what's going to happen with that content is you're going to think to yourself, is this guy for me? Right? So is he speaking my language? If you're an author, your ears are probably perked up. If you've ever thought about coming out with a book, if you're just thinking platform, like you're getting to know me and to find out whether or not I'm a good fit for you. And so that content is that piece where the more content you put out in the world and the more you spread it, you're going to get introduced to new people with that content. When they see it, they're going to make a decision about whether or not you're right for them. And once you turn this path around and you go from 3 to 2 to 1, you start seeing how it all starts to work together. Because with outreach, You move people from not knowing you exist to knowing you exist. But that's it. I mean, you can do that standing in the line at Kroger. But then the content allows them to kind of get to know you. You know, if you read some of my blog posts, if you hear me on a podcast, at that point you're either like, okay, this guy is for me, or he isn't for me. And you do this all the time with all the content you consume online. You know, you're listening to something, you're trying to decide, is this worth my time? Is this not worth my time? And then what I do is once you have consumed some of my content, I say, hey, if you like what you're hearing, if you think I'm a good fit, I want you to give me permission to stay in contact long term, and you should go to my website, sign up for my email list. And then I have a long-standing connection. And you see now how I have a path that moves people all the way from never even having ever heard of me all the way down to giving me their email address so I can stay in contact with them long term. And so that's how we look at building a platform. Is I'm constantly looking to fill those three buckets. I'm looking to for opportunities to move people from not knowing I exist to knowing I exist, and that can again be speaking at conferences, writing on a guest post, being a guest on a podcast, whatever it is. And then I share content, and then I invite them to my email list. And as long as I have those three pieces in place, and I'm constantly have something happening in each of those three things, my platform keeps growing, growing, and growing.
So I get it, and I love the simplicity of it, right? I can remember this. I can go and share this with my wife on a cocktail napkin, right? I like the simplicity of the strategy. Are there tools, like you went for permission straight to a tool, right? You have one, ConvertKit and MailChimp. Are there tools for content and outreach, or there tactics there that you would say, if you only did one thing, I would start here? Or can we go there on those two steps?
Yeah, it's a little harder, and that's why. So here's the problem: is most people do start with the tactics. So like a lot of times, I read tons and tons of stuff about like guest posting on blogs or whatever, and it's
Right.
like there are so many industries, so many places, so many situations where that doesn't make any sense. Like it will not work for you, and all you'll do is feel like you're slamming your head against the wall. But there's other ways that you can do outreach. And so what I say is I'm constantly thinking, and I'm going to go kind of high level here.
Sure.
I'm thinking, okay, who am I trying to talk to? Like, what is the persona, or whatever you want to call it, of the people that I'm trying to talk to? And for me, of course, it's like I need to talk to authors. But for you, it's going to be something different. You should spend time, if you haven't already, and this is in 100 different business books, just basically deciding who your customer is. And then once I know who that is, I can start thinking, okay, where do those people congregate? Where do they congregate in real life? Where do they congregate online? What blogs do they read? What podcasts do they listen to? And then I start looking for opportunities to show up in those places. So if it's conferences, I start submitting to speak at conferences. If it's certain podcasts, I start submitting to be interviewed on those podcasts. If it is blog posts or blogs, I submit to write for the blog, or to have my book reviewed on that blog, or to do something on that blog. I just look for any opportunity where I can show up where my potential people are. And then whenever I'm there, my number one goal is to get them on my email list. So like I've already mentioned it a couple times here, and I'll keep mentioning it. Like, I want you to go to my website, timgrahl.com, and sign up for my email list. That's where all my best stuff is. And so every time I try to connect those three pieces together. But there isn't, I encourage people to start doing something like, if they don't know how to create content, like starting a blog and putting themselves on a schedule is a really good place to start, because it helps you practice creating content. What I found is outreach and content are very much learned skills, very similar to learning something kind of vague, like learning the guitar, right? So the guitar is both like very precise where you put your fingers, but it's also very artistic about how you play. And I found outreach, because when I learned to play the guitar, it was, there's no like one way to learn to play the guitar. You just have to practice and let the art and the pragmatic kind of come together. And I found the same with outreach and content. It's very much the same, where you just have to get started, and you're going to learn techniques, and you're also going to learn the art of it as well. And like I've gotten really good at the art of it, is I do really good promotion of myself, but nobody feels like I'm like over promoting myself or something. You know, like most of the time I get really good feedback. And so it becomes this art of like marrying together constantly being helpful and being relentlessly helpful by sharing everything I know, but at the same time inviting you to go deeper and be a part of what I'm doing. I don't know if that was a helpful answer or not.
No, it's a real helpful answer. I was just waiting, because I am trying to not do the rehearsal dropout thing where I'm thinking about what I'm going to say and stop listening. I was focused. The blog for me, when you think about that, I would agree in this day and age because one, it's also a free resource, and increasingly, it's a multimedia resource. So if you're not a writer, you don't have to write on a blog anymore. If you want to do spoken word, there's the podcast, which to me is a little bit like a blog, but it's just delivered through audio. And you can even put that in a blog platform, and you could also do it as a video blog. So I think if you kind of have a sense of, I have expertise in an area, this is my business, this is our expertise. We sell real estate. What would be the most natural way for me to convey that? Where am I most comfortable conveying it? And finding a way to do that on a platform like a blog that can be spread widely. Is that a good kind of summation of what you said or an addition to that? I don't want to lead us down straight because you are the expert, but that's where my mind goes.
Yeah, like what I encourage people is to look out at what they are enjoying consuming and start there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I did. I had a client one time that just couldn't wrap her head around blogging. Like she's one of these writers that just like agonized over every sentence. So
Mm-hmm.
the idea of like banging out a 1,000 word blog post and just hitting publish without like going through 800 rounds of editing just locked her up. And so I was like, well, why don't you just like put on a headset and record what you want to say, and we'll start putting that out as like audio on your blog. This was kind of before podcasts got big. And then she started blogging on a weekly basis because she just did the audio.
Right.
And I'm in the middle of doing this with Sean Coyne as well. We talked about him before we jumped on, where he has his website storygrid.com, and he was kind of coming to the end of like I don't want to keep writing these really long articles, but I want to create more content. So we started a podcast together, and each week we post a new episode, and then 5 days later he puts the entire transcript on his website. So he's creating just copious amounts of content, but it's only taking a little bit of his time. And
Yeah.
it's in a format that's much easier for him to produce than written word. And so, yeah, the important thing is, I mean, I always come back to the question of like, how can I be most helpful? Like, I have an audience of people that I'm trying to talk to and I'm trying to build, and I'm just trying to help them reach their goals and their dreams in life. How can I do that? And it's like, how can I do it where I'll actually do it, right? So if you think I want to, what would be really helpful is this really highly produced YouTube channel where I'm putting out these excellent 30-minute pieces. But like, if you just don't ever get around to doing it, that's not helpful to anybody. So
No.
what's like the job? What's what you can start doing like next week and putting it out? And again, it's extremely it's something you have to learn by doing. And so beginning to just dip your toe in the water, and start putting out content. And again, if you're constantly asking yourself, am I being helpful? Am I being helpful? If more people find this, am I going to help more people reach their goals and dreams in life? And you'll find it. Even you'll make mistakes along the way, but that doesn't matter because you trying to help people is what will shine through. And so you do that long enough, and what you do is you just build this giant base of people that would like stab somebody for you because you've done so much to help them. And I get emails like that, people that have never bought a single thing from me, but they're constantly telling everybody about me.
Mm.
And so I really, when I first heard Zig Ziglar say, if you help enough people get what they want out of life, you'll get what you want out of life too. I'm going to be honest. I rolled my eyes, and I'm like, well, that's easy to say when you're like 70 and have been rich for like 30 years, or whatever. It's like, great, that's nice. But what I've learned is it is the most pragmatic way to build a business. It is. I started doing it on purpose to build a group of people that owed me one. Like that's basically what I was doing, And it just
Tim, are you
like
there?
I just find if I just keep going out and helping more people, I get more of what I want out of life.
I love that. I mean, in terms of that keeps your it's not you're not marketing to your outcomes. If you focus on the outcomes for your customer, that actually ends up working almost every time. And we've experienced that, and I think it's just a good framework. I think if people get caught up in speaking to themselves and instead of their audience, it can get a little weird and wonky. I wanted to just highlight two things that you said that I think are very instructional, and if people miss them, I think whatever you decide to do, pick something that you will do. If it's too fancy or too complicated, it does no one anybody good any good. And that was kind of where I was leading less elegantly with pick a channel, audio, video, writing that feels natural because that's the thing that you'll do. I know personally, I put a lot less of my editor brain into audio content than written content, so I actually can produce it, which is one of the reasons I'm doing webinars. I can do this
Yeah.
sort of live content, and my editor brain stays quiet, and my teacher brain is doing just fine. And I can, well, otherwise I would just freak out and I would try to make it perfect, and it would never see the light of day. And so,
Right, right.
yeah, and so that's just a reality, and everybody needs to just cross that bridge for themselves. And the other one is you said that these are skills, and I want to agree because I'm also an introvert that's had to learn how to go on stages and do all the things that authors have to do or think they have to do. You might coach me on that to be successful, but they're skills that you build. And I remember I heard this, it was an overheard conversation, maybe it was a podcast, but the advice was basically, one of the most successful shows ever was Seinfeld. Go back and watch the very first episode. And it's not Seinfeld yet. All the
Right.
characters are there.
Oh, that's funny you bring it up. I just listened to like an hour and a half long interview with Julie Louis Dreyfus, and she was talking about that.
Okay, well, I didn't hear that, but that was the metaphor. And I went and did it. I looked up the first episode, and it's so true. It's like a primitive version of what I came to love and adore. But you can see that the pieces are there, but they haven't quite gotten honed, right? It takes them almost the whole season to kind of find their stride. And in my experience with any craft, writing, blogging, whatever, you go back and listen to the early ones, it barely is recognizable from what you came to know and love. And I went back and listened to the very first Lewis Howes broadcast, right? He's this huge mega, podcaster, and it's just a webinar that he stuck up as a podcast, right? And it's okay, but it's nothing like what he became. And I think we forget it's that arc of success that I had on the screen. What begins small, 2-inch domino, it'll build faster than you think. But be okay with the small steps in the beginning because you're just building those skills and you will get better if you keep doing it.
Yeah, and before because we're jumping to questions here in a couple minutes.
Yeah, let's remind
Yeah.
people if you've got a question, we've got a couple. Go ahead and ask the question in the questions toolbar. If you've got questions about any of these areas, permission, content, outreach, that even specific to your business, put them in there and we'll do our best to answer them. So, with that reminder in place, what were you about to say, Tim?
Yeah, so one of the things I know people struggle with is coming up with what to write about or what kind of content to put out. And I found the simplest way is to just ask people questions. So if you just have like a group of 10 people, and they don't have to be on an email list, just 10 people you know that are like your personas, the people you're trying to connect with, and just say, hey, what are the biggest problems you faced in X, Y, or Z? Or what were the biggest challenges? Or, what could I have done better when we worked together? And you'll just get this list of things, and you'll see a lot of them have similar questions or similar hangups. That's where you start. Is do the definitive blog post answering that question. Like one of the things I did on my website now 2.5 years ago, over 2.5 years ago, is I kept getting all these questions about what should I have on my author website. So I just wrote this 3,000 word blog post about how to build the ultimate author website, step through the entire thing. It is still one of my most visited blog posts because that is a common problem, and it brings in people on to my email list every single day still. And I just started with what were the questions that I'm getting on a regular basis. And so if you're struggling with what kind of content to create, like, oh, that's great, I can set up a free blog on WordPress, but now what am I going to write about? Just start answering questions. Like, what are the most common questions you get? If you know, when people say, you know, what do you do, and you tell them, and they start asking you questions, like those are the questions that you want to start with. And if you just start answering those common questions by writing blog posts or doing audio or whatever, you know, whatever format you do, doesn't matter as much. That's the place to start with building content.
I want to echo that too. I remember I had the challenge of writing a book called Social when I wasn't even on Facebook, and I had to ramp up fast. And I was interviewing all these people that were big in the space, and this woman, Mariana Wagner in Colorado, was a huge blogger in the real estate side. And she said the same conversation. If you're in a service business, right, where you personally work with clients, this really works. Just go to your sent folder on your email and start scrolling through those. And you'll
Yeah.
find the questions that people already asked you and you've already written the answer. So just start copying and pasting those, and you'll find, like, in the real estate example, because that's where, my wife's business lives, what do I need to do to prepare for an inspection on my home? Well, you answer that question 3 or 4 times in an email, you look for those 3 emails, you can cobble that in 15 minutes, you've got a post. You've got the content because you already have the expertise. You're just not used to putting it out on this channel.
Yeah, it's really a change in mindset. Like, actually, I went through this like year-long thing where I worked with a ton of like journalists, you know, that were coming out with their own books and all that kind of stuff. And they were so used to getting assignments and then writing, right? So I get this assignment to write this article, so I then go out and research that and write it, or I get this book deal, so I go research and write this book. But getting them to flip it around where they saw their life as a constant source of content, um, that's the kind of change you have to make, is like, what am I learning currently? What have I been researching? You know, if you're in a field that, if you're, whatever field you're in, you're constantly reading about it, you're listening to things about it, you're learning about it, you're talking to other people about it, you know, what are you learning? You know, that's great stuff to share. I actually keep a file in Evernote, and I keep it as a shortcut in my Evernote on my phone. That's just blog post ideas. And anytime I get questions, anytime I get email questions like that, or I'm reading something new and I'm like, oh man, my audience would love that. Like, I just drop it in that list. I got that idea from, that's how Scott Adams does Dilbert, is he
Huh.
keeps a Word document of, I mean, I don't know if he still does, but I read this years ago, that he keeps a Word document of ideas for comic strips. Like, just whenever they pop in his head, he just writes them down. So when he's under deadline and he's got to sit down and produce a strip, he's not starting from ground zero. He just scrolls through his ideas until one jumps out at him, and that's what he does. And so I do that as well, as I keep a running list of ideas for future blog posts or audio or webinars or whatever, so that so when they pop in my head, or if I'm at a conference and somebody asks me a question and I'm like, oh, that'd be good, you know, I can drop into Evernote and I just add it there.
Cool. We've got a few questions now. Before we go to those, so people, if you've got a question for Tim, please type it in there, and we can and go to those. And it certainly looks like we'll be able to nail all of them with the time we have remaining. I got a couple more to kind of, before I ask you if there's any final words before we go to Q&A. What do you think the biggest mistakes are that people make when they're starting down this journey?
Um, well, not starting,
Okay.
first of all. Not building an email list, thinking that like if they just get enough Twitter followers or enough Facebook friends or fans, that's all they need. You know, an email list is so much better. That's probably a big one. Um, you know, the other is just not focusing on being relentlessly helpful. You know, especially in my world, like so many people are like, I gotta sell books, I gotta sell books, I gotta sell books, and it's like, so everything they do kind of falls flat because it just shines through that all they're trying to do is sell more of their book,
Yeah.
instead of having that long-term view of being relentlessly helpful for, and you stack that up for years and you're going to be successful. So I see a lot of people like jump out and like the first blog post will be about like how to hire them or something, you know, and it's like, well, that's, nobody's really interested in that. So always putting yourself in the other person's shoes, empathizing with what they want out of life. You know, Ramit taught me something really important. When I tried to come out with my first product and nobody bought it, he was like, and I asked him about it. He goes, "Do people lay awake at night worrying about that thing?" And I was like, "No." He said, "There's your problem." And so I'm constantly like, okay, putting myself in the other person's shoes, and what are
Repeat
they
that
laying
question.
awake?
Do people lay it? That's great. I want. Can you just repeat that? I'm sorry. That
Yeah.
that was great.
He said, "Do people lay awake at night worrying about what you're talking about?" And the answer in most cases is no. People
Right.
aren't worrying. Yeah. And so, like, my first class I tried to sell was this thing about like how to make your Amazon presence better. And he's like, "That's not what people aren't laying awake at night worrying about that." And then the product that sells a ton now is my launch a bestseller product. People, authors, definitely lay awake at night wondering if they're going to be able to sell enough copies of their book. And so I always am trying to empathize with, where are the pain points that people are stuck? How do they talk about them in their mind? And just answer those fundamental questions to help people get what they want out of life.
Cool. I guess my only other question is, and then we're going to go to some of the Q&A. Do you see this fundamentally changing? Like email, that's where we are today. Do you see this like the idea of how we get permission and how we communicate? I mean, you're on top of this. Do you see this changing in the near future, or is this kind of around for the foreseeable?
So, the reason I always start with permission content outreach is I don't think those three will ever change. But, the moment that something else works better than email, I'm throwing email out and I'm going to the new thing.
Right.
Like I'm not like I don't have like stock in email marketing or something. Like I pick the thing that works the best. Now, it's going to take a big change to get people over it, but who knows? I mean, I was just talking to a friend of mine who his son's in college. His son didn't learn how to use email until he was in college, and that was just because the professors made them use email, and he had to like you have to explain to them what email is. For us, email it's like that stuff you get in the mailbox but online. But for them, it's like long form texting.
Yeah.
You know, so will something else supplant email as like the way that people communicate? Maybe. Um, and as soon as it does, I will ditch email and jump on the new thing. But I don't like predicting the future because like even people that are good at it get it wrong most of the time. I'm much more like what's working right now and keep a pulse on that. And like right now, email is what works, and that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon.
Cool. I always want to ask that because, when you said what keeps people up at night, when I'm interviewing an entrepreneur, that's often the question I like to ask. And it's usually about what do they see that might be changing in the future. So I kind of went to there. So, really quickly, thank you so much for that content. That was great. And I love that you kept us on the timeless and were allowing us to also go into kind of some of the tactical stuff. The first question we have is from Heath, and he asked if email is the number one tool, right, for the permission, what social media outlet would be second to email? Is there a number two or three on that list?
So social media, it depends on how you think about social media. If you're thinking of social media as a one to many, so email is one to many, right? So I can send one email and it goes to 33,000 people. People try to think of social media as one to many, and it doesn't work that way. Um, you think like, oh man, I got 5,000 followers, but in any given tweet that you put out, and I hate using that word as a grown man, but any tweet that you put out, I would guess if you actually tracked it, because I actually tracked it. I had a client that had over 100,000 Twitter followers, and we would put stuff out. We actually tracked how many people clicked the link, and it was the highest end was 750, and then it would go down to about 250. So think about that: 100,000 followers, and you could only get 750 people to even click. Forget buying anything. But what I found is these tools, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn especially, are really good in one-on-one connections, right? So people that will not email you back, they may reply to you on Twitter. You know, so um, but I am almost, if you like go look at my online presence besides my like on Twitter, Facebook, any of these things, I'm basically not there because what I found is, oh, well, this is great. It's like the 95% of work that gets the 5% of results. It's just a complete disaster for the amount of time you have to put in to get anything out of it. And so I just don't do it pretty much. I check in on Twitter about 3 or 4 times a week, try to reply to people if they ping me there, and that's pretty much it.
I found the same thing through my own experimentation, and I found it very validating that you'd actually done the math because I found that it was a lot of work to be present, and there was value to it on those channels, but I had to really guard my time there because I wasn't seeing it wasn't a multiplier. Like it didn't have a lot of
Well,
leverage. And I think the
you
last
know,
thing
a
I
lot.
learned, the half life of a tweet, there I am using it too, is like it's like 24 seconds. So it's not like an email that's waiting to be read. It may never be seen at all on a lot of these channels.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing to remember is that, man, what was I going to say?
Sorry.
Geez, something you said like popped out at me. Um, oh, yeah, the amount of work that goes into it. A lot of people are like, yeah, but I like Facebook. Yeah, but I like Twitter. And it's like, that's totally fine. But, a lot of people, there's a bucket of things I do for pleasure, and there's a bucket of things I do for work. I watch Netflix at night for pleasure, right? If you like Twitter and you just love it, put it in the pleasure box and do it as much as you want, okay? But don't call it work because it's not actually getting anything done.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people do this stuff telling themselves, oh, I'm getting work done, but they're not getting anything done. So I'm not like, Facebook is evil, Twitter is evil. It's like if you enjoy it, do it, but it's not work. It's not actually getting anything done 98, 99% of the time.
When I was writing that book, Social, I had a little sticky note on my computer screen and it asked the question. It was my little accountability. Am I networking or am I just not working? That maybe
Yeah.
that goes that.
Yeah.
So I'll venture, and you can tell me if I'm right because I know Heath wanted what would be the number two. I actually think not social media. The only other thing that I think operates like a would it be actually like physical mail get you some of the same results if you were gonna say like what would be something that looks like works like email but is maybe secondarily effective? Is that even there's no permission there, I guess though.
Well, you're asking me a question that's outside of my expertise.
Got it.
So I don't like to answer this. I don't know. I've never done any direct mail.
Got it. All right. Well, let's go to the next question then. This is from Rob O'Donnell. Um, okay. So, I'm not catching this one thing. What is that word again? Is it how to find? Okay. So, this one got flagged for me. How to find the one thing. It is hard to narrow down. I guess it's like how to find the one thing. I'm going to interpret this because it maybe got garbled on the keyboard. How would you, if you had to choose an area for your content, how would you start and decide this is going to be my one thing for content? Is there like a rule of thumb, like if you're coaching someone?
Yeah. So what I tell people to do, so because I get this question a lot now that I've become more successful in this space, people are like, okay, how do I get started? And it's like, okay, I talked about that Q&A, finding out those questions that people ask. Pick three of those questions that people asked, and then create the definitive answer to those questions. And what I mean by definitive is it is the best answer to that question on the internet. Um, and it's hard. That's why if you Google like how to build an author website, I'm either number one or number two. I always bounce back and forth. And it's because I spent the week writing a 3,000 plus word article to answer that question. Now you can find tons of 300 word, 500 word BS answers to that question that are not actually helpful. And then you have my article, which is the definitive guide. I wanted my article to be where if one author asked another author, hey, what should I put on my website? They would say, oh, I got this article for you. And they'd point to my article.
Cool.
And it does a lot of things. I know we're getting to the end, but I'd like to
Yeah.
explain why. So it does a lot of things. One is it forces you to actually answer the question in a real way. Like you have to step through from A to B to C to D to E and actually answer a question. The hardest thing when I wrote a book that I realized was I give a lot of advice, but I've never actually had to line it all up so it made sense. So
Mm.
it helps you learn how to create new content. And it actually creates content that will help you year after year after year. It becomes timeless and evergreen. It's much easier over the long term to create long form content that people keep sharing than it is to create lots of little articles.
I love that. I was just going to say, like, if you're asking the question, how can I be helpful? Like in this instance, how could I be the most helpful possible? Like you've really taken that to a max.
Yeah,
That's what gets you there. You've written the most helpful article on that currently, and Google's gotten pretty decent at measuring quality versus just links and all the other junk.
yeah. Yeah, so that's where I would start with creating content because it gives you the practice of thoroughly answering a question and showing that you are the expert at answering that question.
Okay.
And that's what I encourage people to start with when they're getting started creating content.
We got a couple of questions there, just like at the last minute, and like just the 30-second answer, because I don't want Chris to be left behind. What would be the one if you had to just say, if you were going to start somewhere on driving people to your site to get the permission in the first place, what would be like a general place that you might say, why don't you go explore this? And I know we kind of hit that earlier, speaking, blogs, like, but where would be like if you had to choose one thing off the top of your head that might fit a lot of people, where would you say for the outreach?
Um, the place that I tell people to start is interview-based podcasts. I like them because they're easiest on you. Like you don't have to write some big blog post. All you have to do is show up and answer questions. And you're being super helpful to the interviewer because they need guests. And so I really encourage people to start by outreaching to interview-based podcasts because they need guests. You're a guest, you're an expert, and all you have to do is show up and answer questions for an hour, and it's usually a lot of fun. So that's where I encourage people to start with outreach.
Great answer. And I completely agree because you can do that and you're really helping them out because the people who commit to these podcasts, it's kind of a grind. They always have to be looking for the next interview. And now you're
Yep.
supplying that for them. So it's a win-win. All right. Any final words of wisdom before we move on? I'm really appreciative of the time you gave us today, Tim.
No, I appreciate you having me on, and I really do encourage people to focus on this and focus on building your platform. It's a long game approach. It's not something that will show huge results in the next month, but once you have it, it just revolutionizes your business and your safety net and your confidence. It will really change your business for the better.
Awesome. Totally agree. Thank you again. A couple of little housekeeping things. Everybody, we will send everyone a link to this. We'll include in that link some of the tools that Tim mentioned. So definitely keep an eye out. You can always check it out if you want to go back and listen to parts of it again. We always post these to our website at theonething.com/webinars. And next month, go ahead and mark your calendars. We're going to have Jeff Goins. He's a great, great authority, has a great podcast, and we'll be talking a little bit about purpose. And that's Thursday, May 19th, the day before I head to Ecuador. So I'll be super pumped up for that day too. Thank you so much. You can definitely reach out to us on Twitter, and we will answer those questions. Tim's already warned you. He's not on there that often. So ask a smart question. Hopefully we'll get to it. Tim, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody else who tuned in today.
Thanks, Jay.